Okay, so in that last video, we showed you kind of what's happening in Git at a high level glance. I showed you a bunch of commands that probably didn't make much sense. Now what I want us to do is talk through what is the mental model going on. And so Git has, in some sense, a pretty complicated setup in terms of how they think about things. We actually think of Git, when you're thinking about making changes and adding to that shared history as being as 4 phases. There's kind of 4 places your changes might live. They might live in the working directory, which is kind of just like the file system on your computer. Like when you save a file and it's there, you can cat it on your terminal and it'll show up the contents. We then think of having the staging area, which is kind of the set of changes that you want to get ready to commit. And it's not going to be super clear right now why we need to have this special area, but it actually is there to provide you flexibility so that you can make lots of changes and then say, I really only want to add these specific changes to my version history. Then your local repository. The repository, remember, is kind of the history of your project. That's the actual step where you're saying, this is a new version of our repo. I'm adding it to my copy of the repo. And then finally, we have to share those changes, share the history we've added with everyone else. The commands I just showed you all transition changes from one of these phases to another. So for example, when you add a file, and I showed you the command called stage, add and stage are the same. They're the same command. I will show you that in a second. When you stage something, you're taking changes in your working directory and adding them to your staging area. When you commit a file, you now add it to your local repository's version history. And then to share that version history with others, you push. So these are our 3 basic commands that we're going to always use. Note, there are lots of Git commands, and the mental model is actually a little bit more complex than what I'm saying right now. But this is a really good starting point for understanding kind of where Git is coming from before we introduce some more complex things. Right now, this probably is already looking pretty complex because it might seem a bit unnecessary. Like, why does Git have all of this? Why isn't every time I save, it just pushes it to GitLab or wherever? And that's to give us flexibility so that we can design what our history should look like. So that it's nice and pretty for everyone else. We don't have to, say every time I save the file, it pushes it to everyone, because maybe I don't want to share the changes I'm making quite yet until I figured out that they work. Let's go back and redo that workflow I just did now that we've talked about this kind of mental model. So let me go to the README and let me add an author section. So I'm going to add author is Hunter Schafer. When this is just editing a file, I just saved it, so it's saved on my computer. If I cat readme.md, it will show me the contents of the file. That's all well and good. But now if I do git status, which was that one command I haven't quite talked about quite yet, git status is trying to tell me what is the state of the files in my repo. Now, to be very precise, it's actually not talking about the official version committed to my local repo. This is all about my working directory. So you can see here that it says changes not staged for commit. What it's saying is I have some files in my repo right now, in the directory that my repo's in, that I've edited, but I have not told Git I want to commit or I want to prepare to commit. And so this is telling me here that I have made some local changes that are not currently backed up. So the first thing we do, we can't just commit to our local version of the repo right away. The first thing we have to do is prepare to commit. The way we do that is we stage. So you'd say git stage readme.md, the name of the file. Notice my slide said git add, so you can say git add instead. That's totally fine. They're both exactly the same. In fact, instead of the man pages for Git, they have the help pages, which is much better named. You can say git help stage, and it even says right here, this is just a synonym for git add. They're literally the same command. There's absolutely no difference besides the things you type. From a teaching perspective, I like the command stage better because it's a little bit more clear in indicating you're putting it in the staging area, also called the index, rather than add, which is like, is it adding it to the repo or whatnot? You're staging it, you're putting it in your staging area. So now if you do git status after all that, it's now showing you something slightly different. It's saying, hey, instead of having changes that you're not staged for commit, you have some files that are getting ready to be committed. You put them in your staging area, and so it shows you those in green instead of red. Now, why is this important? Why is it important to have this staging area? Is because so far I have not yet added a version to my local repo. There is no version in my repo that has this change. To make this a little bit clearer, let me go make another change to a file. So I'm going to go edit products.java, and I'm going to maybe add a comment at the top here. Like, this is a file to list all products we sell, or something like that. So what I've just done there is I've edited this file. If I do git status now, it's showing that I've staged to get ready to commit the README, but I have not done that with products.java because I never staged it. If I were to make a commit right now, it would only commit the changes that I've currently staged that are in this index, the staging area. It will not commit any files in my working directory that I have not yet staged. So if I were to commit right now, the only thing that would be added in that local version of my repo is this change to the README. I'm not going to worry about that case of committing one thing but not another quite yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and add products.java, stage it to our staging area. And then if I do git status, you can see, whoops, I typed the wrong name. Git stage products.java. And then if I do git status, it shows I've staged both of those things. Now, if I want to do a commit, I'm going to say git commit, and I'm going to give it a message, -n. Maybe I'll just call this some random changes. There's nothing really important there. If I do git status now, it says, hey, there's nothing there. It turns out it also gives you some helpful information saying that I have one commit here that I've not shared with GitLab, which in the fancy Git words is called origin master. We'll talk a little bit about that more next week. To make this a little bit clearer, if you look at my GitLab, this new commit that I just done is not there. It's not on GitLab because I never pushed it. To make this a little bit clearer, let me flip over here. I have this other slide that shows you what git status is all about. It's all about that working directory and that staging area. It's telling you kind of what changes have you made locally versus what changes are you kind of getting ready to commit. Git status is not really about kind of what the commits are in your repo, kind of what the history is. There's this other command called Git Log that helps you do that. So if you type Git Log, it actually shows you the history of all of the commits that you've made in your repo. So what it shows you here is it's showing in reverse chronological order. So this is the most recent commit. I called it some changes. And you can see I'm recording this at an atrocious time in the morning because I tried to do this earlier and everything broke. Then my earlier commit, update readme, and then that initial commit. First thing I'll highlight, one of the most important aspects of a Git commit, or important because it comes up so frequently, is this commit hash. Each commit gets an ID associated to it, which is kind of derived from the set of changes in a very complex way that looks random, but it's kind of complex. This hash tells you is a unique identifier for that set of changes. So you can actually see the thing that GitLab identifies everything by are these commit hashes. So it says, oh, this update readme. It doesn't actually care about this message so much besides display purposes. What it really cares about is FE5BB2B9. You can see here this update readme is FE5BB2B9. When I added a new commit, it's up here. And you can kind of see, I mentioned that origin master thing is kind of the GitLab version of the repo. It's kind of like this is where GitLab thinks the current version is. You can see Git Log is trying to show you that and saying, hey, you have this new commit up here called some random changes with this really funky hash as its ID, but GitLab thinks the last commit was the most recent one. And so then when you do a git push, that's actually sending your commit up and saying, hey, GitLab, there's a new version of this program. Please check this out. And then if you do git log in your terminal, you'll see that now I've actually updated origin master to kind of reflect that. Don't worry too much about this origin master business. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of working. It matters more when we think about the context of working with others. Today and in your homework for this week, we're really only focusing on working by yourself. Kind of what is the mental model of Git that we're working on? How do I use it? And kind of what is it operating with? Before we stop this video and talk about some more practicalities of Git, I want us to practice kind of what we've just been talking about. So suppose I run a git status command in my terminal, and it outputs the following. It says this thing here. Based on this information, what location are the changes to file 1 and file 2 within that git phases diagram I showed you a couple slides back? So is this in the working directory, the index or the staging area, the local repository, or the remote repository? Take a second and think back of what if this git status says this, where are we in this process? Okay, so hopefully you had some time to think about it. As a reminder, when you see this changes not staged for commit, this is giving you a hint that it's kind of before that staging area. So it's going to end up being in our working directory here because we haven't gotten ready to tell Git we want to commit those. And so now, could potentially be a point to highlight, why does Git have this complex setup of your working directory, staging area, local repository, and remote repository? And it's all about flexibility. It's all about letting you choose what you want to add to your version history and what you don't want to. So for example, suppose you're working on your program and you add a bunch of print statements all over the place, and you also make some real logic changes so that it actually, fixes any bugs you ran into. I haven't shown you how to do this, but staging actually has the ability to stage parts of a file. You can say, oh, only stage this part and this part and this part. And then you could say, only apply that to the real changes, the non-print statements. And so you could say, these are the things I actually want to add to my version history. And then maybe later, maybe you want to keep those print statements around for later, or maybe you just want to delete them now. You now don't have to commit the print statements along with everything else because you get to choose what goes into the staging area. And then from the staging area, you commit to your own local repo, and you can make your own local history of things before deciding to say, okay, I have enough to share with my partner or share with anyone else by pushing to everyone else with this repo. And so this is all about giving you flexibility. I haven't shown you how to do some of these steps, but they're all possible with Git. Okay, so in our next video, we're going to talk about some practicalities with Git and give you a little bit of preview of what it's going to look like when we want to work with others.